In the city of Ur, where gods were carved from clay and worshipped in shadowed temples, one man heard a voice unlike any other. It spoke in the stillness, calling him to leave everything, his home, his family, his gods, for a promise he could not see. This is the journey of Abraham. A journey from the safety of walls to the uncertainty of open deserts, from the weight of idols to the fire of an unseen God. He would walk through betrayal, famine, and war. He would face the unthinkable on the heights of Moriah. And he would learn that true faith is not in what you can hold, but in who holds you. The promise was greater than his years, greater than his doubts, greater than the stars above him. And it began with a single step into the unknown.
What if the most important journey of faith started with a whisper? Abram, who lived in the busy city of Ur, heard a call from God that would change his life forever. But at first, he didn't obey. He hesitated. How does a man leave everything he knows behind for a promise he can't see? This is the story that hasn't been told about how Abraham took his first steps toward becoming the father of nations. If you like stories about faith, subscribe to this channel for more in-depth looks at biblical characters. Your support through Super Thanks helps make these stories real. Please tell us where you're watching from by leaving a comment with your name, city, and time. Tonight, we step into the world of ancient Ur, where one man's doubt became the foundation of nations. The baked brick walls of Ur rose like fake mountains around Abram, protecting him from the strong winds in the desert. Families kept clay statues of Nana, the moon god, who was thought to control the rivers and seasons, in their courtyard homes. Ziggurats rose above these homes. Abram saw vendors selling amulets to keep evil spirits away every morning. Priests chanted prayers to make sure the harvests were good. This was his world, predictable, structured, and based on rituals that had been passed down through the years. Then there was the whisper. Not in the busy temple courts where incense curled up to the sky, but in the quiet before dawn when Abram looked over his flocks. A voice that had no shape said his name and promised him lands he had never seen and children he could not count. The words burned hotter than the sun in Mesopotamia at noon. They went against everything I had taught him about how the gods talk to people, through omens, sacrifices, and never directly. Abram first thought it was just tiredness or the wind playing tricks on him. But the voice kept coming back no matter what he was doing, like when he was kneading dough with Sarai, or looking at his father Terah's idol workshop. The social fabric of Ur tightened around him like a noose. In Nana's name, neighbors traded silver and barley. Marriage contracts called on the goddess Inanna to bless the couple. To question these practices meant risking exile from the trade networks that fed his family. Before they could read, Lot's Uncle Haran's kids, including Lot, learned how to carve statues of gods. What would Terah say if Abram told him he heard a god with no image or temple, telling him to leave the city? Abram fought with the two sides of the issue for weeks. Gave him real security, like irrigation canals that brought water to his fields and armed guards who patrolled caravan routes. The voice made a promise, but it could not be trusted. But every time he touched the household idol in his bedroom, its cold clay felt like nothing under his fingers, and doubt ate away at him. Why would gods, who need people to shape them, have the power to change people's lives? One night, as torches flickered on the ziggurat steps, he realized the truth. This wasn't the vague whisper of spirits that scared the Mesopotamians. The voice knew him and told him to come forward instead of asking for sacrifices to calm it down. That realization went deeper than fear of the unknown. The whispers would follow him if he stayed. He put his future on the line by leaving for a god who wouldn't show himself. Abram started secretly gathering supplies by the next moon cycle. He watched Sarai grind grain and wondered if she would follow a man who was chasing voices. Terah's workshop tools were still where they had always been, making gods that would never answer. The voice had broken his world apart, and no matter how hard he tried, Abram couldn't pretend he hadn't heard it. The night Abram told Sarai about the voice, the oil lamps made the shadows in their sleeping area look scary. As he talked about the promised land, descendants and blessings, her hands stopped moving on the loom. She didn't laugh or say it was crazy. Instead, she asked questions that made him doubt. Who would keep them safe outside of Ur? How would they live without family ties or support from the temple? Her worries were the same as the ones he was too afraid to admit to himself. When you leave, you don't just leave behind bricks and mortar. In Ur, a man's father's house told people who he was. Legal papers called people son of before giving their names. Clan endorsements were needed for trade agreements. If Abram didn't have these bonds, he would be lost in a world where strangers were suspects and didn't have anyone to protect them. Even the gods here wanted to keep the family line going. Terah's household idols sat in a niche by the door, connecting generations. Generation. If he left them behind, he would be risking the anger of spirits who had protected his family for hundreds of years. The realities of the economy were more pressing than spiritual doubts, as canals watered the pastures near Abram's flocks, which helped them grow. Caravans brought Egyptian linen and Lebanese cedar to markets where his agents sold wool. He would lose fixed assets as a nomad, depending on unpredictable grazing lands and the whims of tribal chiefs. No matter how many times you did the math, the answer was always the same. Staying was the right thing to do. It was dangerous to leave. Abram stayed up for 40 nights watching the stars through the smoke hole. He made a list of reasons to ignore the voice. It could have been a test from Nana or a demon trying to ruin him. He would decide to stay at dawn, but then he would hear the whisper again over the sound of sheep bleating. The household gods didn't help. They just stared blankly at Sarai as she put out her morning offerings. Terah saw that his son was distracted. He talked about expanding the idol trade to Haran, where the moon cult also thrived, over a few beers. He gave Abram a newly made statue and said, "Our family has carved divine images since the great flood." The clay was still warm, and its shape was the same as hundreds of others before it. That night, Abram ran his thumb over the idol's face and realized that no hand had ever made the voice that called him. The barley harvest was the turning point. As the workers sang hymns to Dagon, the voice didn't whisper. It gave clear orders: leave your country, your people, and your father's house. This time it gave specific directions, to Canaan. There was no divine message in Mesopotamia that was as clear and free of riddles or omens. This was either true beyond Earth's temple rituals or Abram had gone crazy. Sarai was sorting through harvest records on clay tablets when he got there. He said, "We're leaving," without any small talk. She didn't ask if he was sure. His voice was firm, which answered that. Instead, she started rolling up the tablets, which were records of a life they were about to lose. Terah's apprentices were outside chipping away at stone idols, not knowing that their boss's heir had just chosen a god without an image. Terah's rough hands shaped lumps of earth into gods in the workshop, which smelled like wet clay and burnt ochre. Abram watched as his father pushed pieces of obsidian into the eye sockets of a figurine. These two black holes would later be painted with gold to look like Nana's heavenly gaze. There were rows of teraphim on the shelves. Each one was no taller than a man's forearm, and their mouths were carved into permanent smiles. These weren't just pretty things. People thought they were ways for God to protect them, whispering warnings at night and making sure trades went well. Families paid a month's wages for Terah's idols, and then priests anointed them with oil and whispered secret names to make them work. Abram picked up a statue that wasn't finished yet. The torso was still soft under his fingers. When he was a kid, he thought these figures were home to real spirits. The memory of that voice, which he couldn't remember, was so clear compared to these quiet lumps of clay that it made his stomach tighten. "Do they ever talk back?" "Did they?" he asked. Terah's chisel slipped and cut into the idol's cheek. He muttered, "You don't question the gods," as he smoothed out the floor, but the harm had already been done. The question hung in the air like smoke. The Mesopotamians didn't see idols as just symbols. They thought that the statue held the essence of the deity after rituals were done at the right time according to astrology. If you gave them regular offerings, a properly consecrated teraphim could heal sickness, find lost things, and even curse your enemies. Abram knew the rituals by heart. He put honey on his lips so the god would speak sweetly, and a barley cake in its hands so it wouldn't get hungry. But none of these little statues had ever stopped a stillbirth or a sandstorm. The voice that called him didn't need any bribes. Terah threw his tools down on a work table. "You've been acting weird since the harvest," he said, pointing to Abram's chisel, which was still untouched. "We have 20 commissions due before the festival." Outside, vendors were selling amulets to pilgrims who came to see Ur's moon temple. The sounds of a city that trusted its gods pressed against the walls of the workshop. Abram put the broken idol back on the shelf. "What if we've been carving the wrong things?" he said softly. The face of his father grew dark. Terah pointed to the back room of the workshop, where rich customers ordered life-size statues for 10 times the price. "That wrong thing put gold in your wife's ears and meat in your kids' bowls." He pushed a new block of clay at Abram. "Shape or starve." Abram's workbench stayed empty for 3 days. Instead, he walked around the edges of Ur and watched shepherds lead their flocks by voice alone, without any idols. He listened for that other voice at night, hoping it wouldn't come back. But it came back while he was sleeping, repeating the promise in a way that made him feel uneasy. He walked by the workshop when the sun came up, but he didn't go inside. Let Terah say bad things about him. These gods couldn't even complain about being left behind. It didn't feel like rebellion to realize it. It was easier than that. It wasn't divine at all if people could shape it. Sarai saw him putting their tent poles in the storage jars. She put her hand on his shoulder. There was no need for words. Terah's apprentices were laughing behind them as they glued a wig onto a statue of a goddess. The difference was almost funny. The gods of Ea needed people to do their hair. The voice that called Abram didn't need anything. The festival of the first fruits had started, and drums and the smell of roasted meats filled the streets of Ur. Abram stood at the edge of the crowd as priests brought Nana's silver chariot to the ziggurat. The crescent moon emblem on the chariot shone in the sun. Everyone was supposed to walk behind it, including merchants in linen tunics, potters with flower-covered hands, and even kids waving palm fronds. But Abram stayed still with his arms crossed over his chest. A guard in the city pushed him with the butt of a spear. He said, "Move, or ask the magistrate tomorrow." Terah hissed his son's name through clenched teeth behind them. Not going to the procession was more than just a sin. That was treason. Kings got their power from temple support, and people who disagreed with them were a threat to the social order. By sunset, market sellers mistakenly charged Abram's servants too much for grain. A store owner who had promised Sarai Lebanese cedar for her loom cancelled the order without giving a reason. The punishments were meant to be a warning to anyone who was thinking about disobeying. Economic isolation could kill a family faster than any disease. That night, Lot stayed by Abram's tent and twisted the fringe of his cloak. He had trained to be a scribe at the temple school when he was 15. There, priests taught that a man's future depended on Nana's favor. "They're saying you've gone crazy," he said in a low voice. Abram looked at his nephew's face. He was too young to remember a time before the voice, but old enough to be afraid of what it would mean. He asked slowly, "What if the gods we see are just things we've made?" Lot turned pale and stepped back as if the words were contagious. Sarai, on the other hand, packed their storage jars with calm purpose. When her neighbors crossed the street to avoid her, or when the baker pretended not to see her coins, she didn't flinch. Her practicality had always kept Abram's dreams in check, but now she moved with quiet determination, taking their home apart stitch by stitch. She put her hand on his chest that night while he was staring at the ceiling. She said simply, "If we stay, they'll stone us." Ebosta. By dawn, they had heard the rumors. The elders of the city had asked King Ur-Nammu to look into Abram's disloyalty. The code of Ur-Nammu said that not taking part in state rituals could lead to losing property or being sent away. A bronze dagger to the ribs, which would rust in the wound, was a worse punishment for going against the gods. Abram waited for the guards to switch shifts. He pointed to the flocks of sheep grazing and put a finger to his lips to wake up his shepherds. Sarai shook Lot awake and gave him a bundle of bread. They moved like shadows through the sleeping city, past the workshop where Terah's unfinished idols stared blankly at them. As Abram's group slipped into the dark before dawn at the northern gate, a paid-off guard turned his back. As the walls faded behind him, the last thing Abram heard was Lot's shaky breath and the sound of temple cymbals ringing in the distance. Ur's gods were not saying goodbye to their most wayward son. As the last light of Ur's torches faded behind Abram, the dust settled thick on his sandals. 73 people walked through the dark without the moon. Shepherds pushed scared flocks along, servants balanced water skins on their heads, and Lot looked back every dozen steps. Sarai walked next to Abram, her veil wet with tears that she wouldn't let him see. There were no marching songs during this exodus, just the sound of goats bleating nervously and carts creaking under their weight. It wasn't possible to travel light when every item was necessary for survival. There were 28 donkeys in Abram's caravan, and they were carrying tent cloth, grinding stones, and barley sacks. There were 4 armed guards on either side of the group, and they weren't just there for show. Bandits and wild dogs hunted down groups of migrants in addition to city patrols. Their own company was the real danger. Terah's older servants whispered about curses, and Lot's young wife jumped at every sound at night. By dawn, the stress had reached its peak. An attendant dropped a wine amphora, and it broke on the rocks. He looked at Abram and said, "No proper libations for the road gods." Others joined in the complaint. Why didn't they ask augurs when the best time to leave would be? Where did people usually hang the protective amulets on their staffs? Sarai quieted them down by taking out a small idol from her bag, one of Terah's broken pieces. When she tied it to the lead donkey, the group clearly relaxed. Abram didn't say anything, but his jaw got tight. Things got worse at noon. The Euphrates sparkled temptingly to the west, but royal orders said that no one could cross without permission. Abram drew invisible maps in the dirt to show the others the way to Haran, which was to the northwest. They followed the Balak River's narrow path through the wilderness. Older shepherds laughed. A man who had lost 2 fingers to frostbite warned, "No wells for 3 days that way. The gods punish those who leave their ancestral lands." Abram told everyone to set up camp in a rocky hollow as the sun set and painted the cliffs red. While the women kneaded dough with the last of their fresh water, the servants rolled out red mats. Lot was crouched down, writing hurried cuneiform on a wax tablet. It could have been a letter to his parents or a request for forgiveness from Ur's gods. Men around the fire talked about whether or not to turn around before the king's horsemen found them. Abram looked into the flames and thought about the voices' promises and the real fear that was all around him. The silence was broken by Sarai's gasp. She pointed east where Venus shone brighter than any torch. Its light made their shadows reach Canaan. In Babylonian mythology, the star's appearance in the month of Nisan meant that things were starting over, but this felt very personal. Abram let out a slow breath. The voice hadn't said anything about heavenly signs, but here was light when he thought there would only be darkness. They left their camp before the sun came up. When Abram told the teraphim to be taken off the donkeys' harnesses, the morning star was still in the sky. This time no one said anything. The idol swayed for a moment before Sarai let it fall to the ground, where its painted eyes stared blankly at the sky they could never touch. The mud-brick walls of Haran rose from the plains like a mirror of with the same familiar shadows cast by its moon temple. There was a reason for the similarity. Both cities worshipped the same gods, spoke the same language, and even had the same bloodlines because people from both cities married people from the other. For Abram's tired caravan, it felt like going home without actually going home. They rented pasture land near the Balak River, where Terah's hands, which were now shaking with age, could no longer make idols but still told merchants what to do. The old man died suddenly while they were harvesting barley. One night, he said that Abram's tent ropes were too thick. By morning, he was dead without warning. The family gathered around the body and stood there for a while. Priests in would have read the descent of Inanna to help them with their spiritual journey. There were only uneasy whispers and Abram's unspoken realization. He was now in charge of 70 souls who had followed him into the unknown. Haran's crossroads were busy with trade. Caravans from Anatolia brought tin for bronze, and Assyrian traders paid a lot for wool. Abram's shepherds moved their flocks north, and their tents looked like white mushrooms on the hillsides. Servants married women from the area. Lot, who is now 19, started making deals without telling his uncle. First, he bought sheep, and then he bought land near the city gates. Sarai watched these things happen without saying anything. Her empty womb was a counterweight to their growing wealth. Every moon cycle that went by without blood was another blow to the promise of having children. The city lured Abram in with its false promises of stability. A rich widow offered her vineyard to his chief herdsman in exchange for marriage rights. Elders asked him to join the merchant council. The moon priests even offered him olive branches, suggesting that he build an altar to Nana next to the god he sometimes talked about. Abram figured out how many years he had left to travel before he got too old to do so. His face had been through 65 winters, and soon his bones would need a break. One night, Sarai saw him looking at the stars outside of Haran's walls. "We could stay," she said, not really a question. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken agreement. Lot was doing well, their flocks were safe, and the voice hadn't spoken since Abram looked at the stars that made up the constellation of the Ram. These were the same stars that had shone over Canaan when the promise was first made. 3 nights later, the voice broke 7 years of silence. Not a whisper this time, but a command. "Look north, south, east, and west. I will give you and your children all the land you see for all time." Abram's hands shook as the words went on, and each syllable was clearer than anything he had heard in Now the promise had shape. His descendants would be more numerous than dust particles. Strangers would bless themselves by his name, and this rented pasture was not the end of the road. Abram told the tents to come down at dawn. Lot complained and pointed to his new brick house near the market. The servants looked at each other. They had built cisterns, planted gardens, and buried family members here. Sarai was the only one who moved quickly, rolling up blankets with the same determination she had shown years before. The caravan was smaller when it came together. 8 families, including Lot's in-laws, decided to stay. Abram didn't say anything. The voice's promises didn't say anything about Haran. The road to the southwest toward Canaan was clear, but the dangers were hidden by the heat. Abram changed the position of his staff, which had been worn smooth from years of not using it. This time, there would be no turning back. As Abram stepped out of the circle of tents, the night air smelled like dry grass and rain far away. There were too many stars in the sky to count, just as the voice had said years before. His arms were still empty of children, and his beard was grayer than when he left Haran. Sarai's womb had not been touched by a miracle at the age of 75. He couldn't stop thinking about the contradiction. How could a man with no heir be the father of nations? "Bring me sacrifices," the voice said again, and the words had a strange weight. It wasn't the usual gifts that Mesopotamians gave to get on people's good sides. It was ritual slaughter that tied 2 groups together. Abram was very familiar with the custom. Kings made treaties this way, walking between 2 dead animals as a silent promise. "If I break my word, may I be torn apart like these beasts." But tonight he would be the one to receive, not the one to start. He chose a 3-year-old heifer from the herd that had no scars on its skin. After that came the goat and ram, then the turtle dove and young pigeon. Abram cut each animal in half and put the 2 halves facing each other as the sun went down. As vultures flew overhead, drawn by the metallic smell, blood seeped into the cracked ground. Usually both people who made the treaty would go between the pieces. Abram stood by himself, waiting for a divine partner who was still hidden. The darkness fell heavily over the plain. There was no voice to explain the delay. Abram swatted flies away from the bodies, which smelled worse in the dark. He started to doubt, had he gotten it wrong? Sarai went back to sleep in their tent because her monthly period had started again that morning. The biological facts were against both of them. Her womb had been empty for a long time, and his body was no longer young. Why would a god tie himself to such hopeless situations? The only sounds at midnight were jackals howling in the distance. Then as the sky in the east began to lighten, things changed. Abram fell into a deep sleep, and his arms and legs felt heavy, as if invisible hands were pushing them down. He saw terrible things in that state between dreaming and waking. His descendants were slaves in a foreign land, suffering for 4 generations before they were finally freed. He should have been scared by the vision, but instead it gave him a terrible hope. If the future held descendants to oppress, then life must spring forth somewhere beyond this barren present. Flames broke out between the animal parts at the first light of dawn. No one lit them. A smoking firepot and a blazing torch moved down the bloody path where no one had walked. The fire burned Abram's face as it passed between the dead bodies, making a one-sided agreement. Voo. There was no doubt about the message. The speaker's faithfulness, not the listener's abilities, was what mattered. Abram finally woke up and the bodies were still there, undisturbed. Only small streams of dried blood and the memory of fire showed what had happened. Sarai called his name from inside the tent, her voice full of worry. He turned toward her, and the rising sun warmed his back. He was an old man standing on land he didn't yet own, trusting words that didn't make sense to anyone else. The test was on its way. Not what he believed, but how much that belief would cost. As Isaac climbed the eastern slope of Moriah, the wood cracked against his shoulders. Abraham changed how he held the firepot and watched his son walk along the shale path. His son was sure-footed, trusting and blissfully unaware that the pile of stones ahead was not just another altar for giving thanks. The knife on Abraham's belt caught the morning light, and its edge was sharper than usual. 3 days had gone by since the voice told him to do the unthinkable. Take your son, your only son, and offer him as a burnt offering. During sieges or plagues, Canaanite kings killed their firstborn sons because they thought the gods wanted them to be completely loyal. Abraham had seen the practice in Salem once when a king burned his son to please Baal after a drought. But this order didn't make any sense. Isaac wasn't just a son. He was the fulfillment of promises made over many years. Every laugh line around the boy's eyes and every curl of his hair screamed miracle. It was proof that a body that had been barren for 100 years could still make life. Now they had to give up their lives on a mountain they had never been to before. Isaac tripped on some loose gravel. Abraham caught his elbow and felt the warmth of the pulse points he had counted as a baby. The fire and wood are here, the boy said. But where is the lamb? The question twisted in Abraham's chest. He had practiced his answers during the sleepless nights of the trip. They were lies about God providing and half-truths that made him sick. Instead, he didn't say anything. He just pulled the rope tighter around the kindling. Abraham carefully built the altar at the top of the mountain. Each stone was placed on purpose, and it took longer than it needed to, as if to put off the inevitable. Isaac watched without saying anything, his brow furrowed, before giving him the wood. The boy had learned how to kill animals by years of herding. He knew where to cut, how to drain blood, and which entrails burned best. He didn't move when Abraham took the rope and tied his hands. He might have thought it was part of a new ritual. He only looked confused when his back was against the pyre. When Abraham picked up the knife, his hand shook. The blade shone in the sunlight, showing scars from years of hard work. The calluses from building altars at Shechem and Bethel, and the burn marks from many burnt offerings were all visible. None were as good as this. Isaac's chest rose and fell quickly, and his breath was shallow but steady. The moment seemed to last forever, stuck between fear and obedience. Then there was a rustle in the bushes. A ram was having a hard time getting through the brambles a few meters away. Abraham's arm stopped in the air. The voice spoke again, this time not to judge but to confirm. Now he knew how deep his own were. As his fingers let go, the knife fell to the ground. Later, when the substitute ram's fat crackled on the altar, Abraham called the place Yahweh, which means the Lord will provide. But the animal at his feet wasn't the real gift. He learned that the God who tested him was not like the bloodthirsty idols of Canaan. It wasn't true divinity that killed children, it saved them. Isaac sat nearby, rubbing his wrists that were free, and watched his father cry over a fire that was burning just the way it was supposed to. The walk back down the mountain was less noisy. Abraham carried the unused kindling, and Isaac carried the pieces of the ram. Sarah would ask about their trip when they got to camp. Abraham already knew what he wouldn't say, that the last test of faith wasn't about being willing to give up, but about being willing to trust the hand that holds the knife. 2 boys were laughing across the field where Abraham was sitting under an oak tree. Isaac, who is now 15, chased Ishmael around the grazing flocks. They forgot about their fight for a little while, but Abraham knew the truth. His sons were from different worlds. Ishmael's strong body showed that he had been living in the desert for decades since Hagar's exile, while Isaac's soft hands showed that Sarah loved him and protected him. Their fights weren't just games between brothers and sisters. They were the first signs of a split that would change the course of history. Abraham's last years saw changes in Canaan. Philistine war chariots rumbled down the coast, and Amorite kings built up cities on hills to keep the Egyptians from expanding. Every trading caravan brought news, Hittite revolts, Babylonian laws, and new gods rising and falling beyond the Jordan. Abraham's descendants were supposed to become a nation in this changing world. But his tent still only had 1 child by Sarah, 1 by Keturah, and Ishmael's scattered tribes. The numbers didn't add up to a lot of stardust. Riches brought with them problems. Gerar's shepherds were jealous of Abraham's wells. He could win small battles with his 300 trained fighters, but he couldn't build a dynasty. When Sarah died at 127, he had a problem he didn't see coming. There were no ancestral tombs in Canaan, only temporary graves. The best burial caves belonged to the Hittites, who had been protecting them for hundreds of years. Ephron the Hittite fought hard for Machpelah's cave and raised the price when he saw how sad Abraham was. 400 shekels bought more than property. It bought him roots in a land that wasn't fully his yet. The purchase took on a deeper meaning. Abraham buried Sarah there because he knew he would be with her soon. Ishmael came back from Paran for the funeral, and his presence made Isaac's family talk. The half-brothers ate together for 3 days, but they didn't tell each other stories because they didn't trust each other. Abraham tried to make things better by giving Ishmael flocks before he left. Neither son knew why he cried as he watched Ishmael's caravan head south. Even though they made promises, there was still doubt. Abraham's body began to fail at 175 years old. His hands shook as he counted out gold for Isaac's marriage to Rebekah. Would this one grandson get more than just debts and arguments? The last test came next. 3 people who didn't know each other showed up at noon, and their feet didn't show any signs of travel. Abraham killed his best calf and was shocked when they made the same promise again, this time with a deadline. The leader said, "When we come back next year, Sarah will have a son." The words hit me like a storm in the desert. Sarah, who was listening at the tent flap, laughed the same doubtful laugh that Abraham remembered from But the strangers didn't tell her off. Their prophecy said that people are weak, but God is always faithful. That tension between what is impossible now and what is certain in the future is what Abraham left behind. Not perfect faith, but faithfulness that kept going even when there were more stars than descendants. The old shepherd looked over his campsite one last time. Isaac knelt next to the new lambs, and Rebekah's laughter mixed with the songs of the serpent. Ishmael's children grew and multiplied far to the south under different stars. The promise was bigger than one person's life could hold, and it began exactly where logic ended. When the voice next called Abraham's name, it wouldn't be from a mountain or an altar. It would be from the cave where Sarah slept. It would be a call home to the unseen country he had trusted long before he saw it. Abraham's story ends where many of ours begin, with a single step into the unknown, not with answers. That first whisper in echoes through the ages, reminding us that faith isn't about being sure. It's about acting when the way isn't clear, when the promise seems impossible, and when it would be easier to stay. His legacy isn't perfect. It's being persistent. He kept walking, even though he couldn't see where he was going, from idol workshops to mountain altars. And that's the invitation we have, to trust the voice that calls us to move forward, even if we don't know why. The stars are still adding up. The trip isn't over yet.